My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 34 years old, and I never imagined that discovering a single letter would shatter everything I believed about my family. The envelope was tucked behind my mother's jewelry box, yellowed with age, bearing my father's handwriting. As I cleared out her belongings 3 months after her funeral, I expected to find keepsakes, photographs, maybe some old recipes. Instead, I found proof that my entire life had been built on lies. The letter was dated 25 years ago, addressed to my mother, and it contained words that made my hands shake as I read them. Words about another woman, another family, another life my father had been living parallel to ours. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing that my mother had known all along, and somehow, this secret had infected every relationship in our family like a slow-acting poison. I collapsed onto her bedroom floor, surrounded by the remnants of her life, finally understanding why holidays had always felt strained, why my brother Marcus had grown so distant over the years, why my sister Emma had moved across the country after college and barely called. We weren't just mourning our mother's death, we were mourning the death of an illusion that had held us together for decades. The woman I thought I knew, the marriage I believed in, the family foundation I had built my own life upon, all of it crumbled in the space of reading those few devastating paragraphs. I spent the next 3 days in a haze, unable to eat or sleep, reading and rereading the letter until I had memorized every painful detail. My father, who had passed away 5 years earlier, had maintained a relationship with Rebecca Thompson for over 2 decades. They had met at a business conference when I was 9 years old. What started as an affair had evolved into something deeper. He had essentially lived two lives, spending weekends and holidays with us while maintaining an apartment across town where he played house with Rebecca and her daughter, Jessica. The financial records I found confirmed it: rent payments, utility bills, even a joint bank account. How had he managed it? How had none of us noticed the missing pieces? The unexplained absences, the business trips that seemed excessive, the way he sometimes seemed mentally elsewhere during family dinners. I remembered now how he would receive phone calls that made him step outside, how he always carried two cell phones claiming one was for work. The signs had been there, but we had trusted him completely. My mother's diary, which I discovered in the same hiding spot, revealed the full scope of her knowledge. She had confronted him in 1999, 3 years after discovering the affair, but instead of demanding he choose, she had made a different decision, one that would haunt our family forever. She decided to stay silent, to preserve what she called the stability of our home, believing that as long as he continued to provide for us and maintain the facade, she could live with sharing him. Reading my mother's innermost thoughts was like watching someone slowly drown while pretending to swim. Entry after entry revealed her growing resentment, not just toward my father, but toward us children for being the reason she felt trapped. She wrote about lying awake at night, wondering what Rebecca's life was like, whether my father laughed differently with her, whether he was more affectionate, more present. The entries became darker over time, filled with a bitterness that had seeped into every aspect of her personality. I began to understand why she had become so critical, so difficult to please, so emotionally distant. She wasn't protecting us from the truth. She was punishing us for being the reason she couldn't leave. The weight of this realization made me physically ill. Every harsh word, every moment of coldness, every time she had made us feel like we were somehow disappointing her, it all made sense now. We had been paying for my father's sins without even knowing it. But the diary revealed something even more disturbing. My mother hadn't been the only one who knew. Marcus, my older brother, had figured it out during his senior year of high school. He had followed our father one Saturday afternoon and witnessed him embracing another woman, kissing her goodbye outside that apartment. Instead of confronting anyone, he had retreated into himself, becoming sullen and rebellious, his grades plummeting, his relationship with all of us deteriorating. My mother knew about Marcus's discovery but never addressed it directly, instead treating his anger as typical teenage behavior. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that our family dysfunction hadn't been random or unexplainable, it had been systematic, a direct result of this massive secret that had poisoned everything we touched. Emma's sudden decision to attend college 3,000 miles away wasn't about adventure or independence, as she had claimed. According to my mother's diary, Emma had overheard a heated argument between our parents when she was 16, during which my mother had finally exploded about the other woman and threatened divorce. Emma had never said anything, but she had started making plans to escape as soon as possible. No wonder she had always seemed so anxious during family gatherings, so eager to leave, so reluctant to bring boyfriends home or talk about her life. She had been protecting herself from becoming too invested in relationships she knew were built on deception. I thought about my own struggles with trust, my tendency to sabotage romantic relationships whenever they became too serious, my deep-seated fear of commitment. How much of my personality had been shaped by the unconscious knowledge that love could be a lie. I had always prided myself on being the family peacekeeper, the one who tried to bring everyone together for holidays and birthdays, but now I understood that I had been trying to resurrect something that had never really existed. The warm, loving family I remembered from my childhood was a carefully constructed performance, maintained through my mother's martyrdom and my father's compartmentalization. We had all been actors in a play we didn't know we were performing. I knew I had to tell Marcus and Emma what I had discovered, but how do you destroy someone's understanding of their entire childhood? How do you explain that every family memory they cherish was tainted by a lie none of us were supposed to know? I started with Marcus, driving to his apartment on a rainy Thursday evening, the letter and diary pages burning like hot coals in my purse. He lived alone in a sparse one-bedroom place, the kind of purposeful simplicity that suggested someone who didn't want to get too attached to anything or anyone. When I told him I had something important to discuss about our parents, his face went pale, and I knew immediately that he was remembering that day he had followed our father. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey without asking if I wanted one, and we sat across from each other at his small kitchen table like adversaries preparing for battle. When I showed him the letter, he read it silently, his jaw clenching and unclenching, and then he looked at me with eyes full of pain and said the words I had been dreading. I already knew. But hearing him confirm what I had suspected didn't make it easier. Instead, it opened up a new wound, the realization that he had carried this knowledge alone for over 15 years, that every family gathering had been torture for him, that his emotional distance hadn't been coldness but self-preservation. We talked until 3 in the morning, sharing memories that now had completely different meanings, piecing together the puzzle of our family's dysfunction with adult eyes. Marcus told me things I had never known, details that painted an even more devastating picture of my father's double life. He had hired a private investigator after that day he followed him, spending his college savings to get proof of what he already suspected. The investigator had uncovered not just Rebecca, but evidence of other affairs over the years, brief relationships that suggested my father's capacity for deception went far deeper than any of us had imagined. Rebecca wasn't just an affair, she was the woman he chose to build a life with while maintaining us as his obligation, his first family that he couldn't abandon without social consequences but clearly wished he could. Marcus showed me photographs from the investigator's file, my father at restaurants with Rebecca, at her daughter Jessica's high school graduation, at birthday parties and anniversaries, playing the role of devoted partner and stepfather while we waited at home for him to return from his latest business trip. The most crushing image was from Christmas Day, 2003, a photo of my father helping Jessica, who was about my age, opened presents in what was clearly Rebecca's living room, wearing the same sweater my mother had given him that morning. He had spent Christmas morning with us, gone through the motions of family breakfast and gift exchange, then driven across town to celebrate the same holiday with his other family. Marcus had been 18 then, home from college, and I remembered how angry and withdrawn he had been that Christmas, how he had left early claiming he needed to meet friends. Now I understood that he had known exactly where our father was going when he made his excuse about needing to check on some work emergency. Calling Emma was harder than facing Marcus because she lived so far away and because I knew this news would shatter the fragile peace she had built for herself. She had worked so hard to create boundaries, to build a life free from our family's toxic dynamics, and now I was about to drag her back into the nightmare she had spent years escaping. When I told her I needed to talk about something I had found in Mom's belongings, there was a long silence on the phone, and then she said, "I was wondering when this day would come." She had known too, not everything, but enough to understand that our family was built on a foundation of lies and secrets. The argument she had overheard at 16 had revealed only pieces of the truth, but those pieces had been enough to convince her that staying close to her family meant staying close to something poisonous. She had spent the last 15 years in therapy, working through trust issues and attachment problems, trying to understand why she felt like she was always waiting for the people she loved to betray her. "I always knew something was wrong," she told me, her voice breaking across the 3,000 miles between us. "I could feel it in the air whenever we were all together, like everyone was performing their roles but nobody was actually present." She made plans to fly back immediately, not because she wanted to revisit the past, but because she realized we all needed to face this together if we had any hope of healing. For the first time in years, we were going to be honest with each other about what our childhood had really been like. Emma arrived on a Friday, and the three of us met at my house, the same house where we had grown up, where we had played out the charade of being a happy family while our parents orchestrated an elaborate deception. Seeing my siblings together in that space, surrounded by family photos that now felt like evidence of a crime, was almost unbearable. We looked like strangers who happened to share DNA, which, I realized, was exactly what we had become. Emma had brought her own discoveries, financial records she had found among my mother's papers that showed my father had been supporting Rebecca's household to the tune of nearly $60,000 a year, money that had come from what we thought was our family's savings. The college funds he had promised us, the retirement account that was supposed to secure my mother's future, all of it had been depleted to maintain his double life. We began to understand why money had always been tight, why my mother had worked extra shifts at the hospital, why my father had always seemed stressed about finances despite his good job. He hadn't just been betraying us emotionally, he had been stealing from our future to pay for his lies. Emma spread the documents across my dining room table, and we worked together like forensic accountants, piecing together the financial timeline of his deception. Credit card statements showing expensive dinners and hotel rooms, jewelry purchases, vacation rentals, all charged to accounts we had never known existed. Meanwhile, we had worn hand-me-down clothes, skipped family vacations, and watched my mother clip coupons and stress about every household expense. The most devastating discovery was a series of birthday cards my father had written to Jessica over the years, cards that expressed a tenderness and pride he had never shown us. "My dearest Jessica," one read, "watching you grow into such an incredible young woman has been the greatest joy of my life." The words felt like physical blows because I could never remember him expressing that kind of unconditional pride about any of us. His relationship with Jessica had been chosen, intentional, free from the obligation and resentment that had poisoned his interactions with his biological children. We had been the family he was stuck with. She was the daughter he had chosen to love. Emma found letters he had written to Rebecca about their future together, plans to divorce my mother once we were all out of college, promises to make their relationship official, to finally stop living a lie. But my mother's death had eliminated his need to make that choice, and according to Marcus's private investigator, my father had married Rebecca within 6 months of my mother's funeral, a fact none of us had known. We had wondered why he seemed to recover so quickly from his grief, why he had been unavailable for family dinners and holiday plans that first year after Mom died. Now we knew he had been planning his wedding, starting his official life with the woman who had been his real priority for decades. The man we had mourned as a devoted husband and father had been counting the days until he could stop pretending to be either of those things. We sat in my living room, surrounded by the evidence of our father's betrayal, trying to process the fact that we had never really known either of our parents. That night, the three of us stayed up until dawn, sharing memories we had never discussed, finally being honest about experiences we had individually tried to forget or rationalize. Emma talked about the crushing loneliness of her teenage years, the feeling that she was living in a house full of people who were all keeping secrets from each other. Marcus described the rage that had consumed him during college, the way he had sabotaged relationships because he couldn't trust anyone's motives, the drinking problem he had developed as a way to numb the constant anger. I admitted my own patterns of emotional unavailability, the way I had always held back from truly connecting with romantic partners, the persistent feeling that love was something that could be revoked without warning. We began to see how our father's betrayal had shaped each of us in different ways, how we had all developed survival mechanisms that made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. Emma had run away, Marcus had shut down, and I had become a people pleaser who never asked for what I really needed. None of us had learned how to form healthy relationships because we had grown up in a house where the primary relationship was built on deception and emotional neglect. But talking about it, finally naming the dysfunction we had all sensed but never addressed, felt like the beginning of something new. For the first time in our adult lives, we were being completely honest with each other, and it was both terrifying and liberating. We made a pact that night: no more secrets, no more pretending everything was fine, no more protecting each other from painful truths. If we were going to have any kind of relationship moving forward, it would have to be built on honesty, even when that honesty was difficult to bear. Over the following weeks, we began the painful process of re-examining every family memory through this new lens. Emma extended her visit indefinitely, and Marcus started coming over for dinner several times a week, not because we enjoyed each other's company, but because we were finally doing the work of getting to know who we really were beneath the roles we had played in our dysfunctional family system. We talked about the holidays that had always felt forced and artificial, understanding now why my mother had been so tense during gift exchanges, why my father had always seemed eager for celebrations to end. We discussed the family vacations that had felt more like endurance tests than fun adventures, recognizing the undercurrent of resentment and distance that had made relaxation impossible. Emma shared memories of lying awake at night, listening to our parents argue in hushed voices about money and time and responsibilities, sensing that these arguments were about more than the surface issues they were discussing. Marcus talked about the way my father had seemed to check out emotionally during important moments, birthday parties, graduations, family dinners, as if he were physically present but mentally elsewhere, probably thinking about Rebecca and Jessica. I began to understand why I had always felt like I was performing for my father's attention, trying so hard to be the perfect daughter that he would finally see me and choose me over whatever was competing for his focus. The realization that nothing I could have done would have been enough, that his emotional absence was about his divided loyalties rather than my worthiness, was both painful and oddly liberating. We were grieving not just the parents we had lost, but the parents we had never actually had, the loving, present, honest parents we had imagined they were. The most difficult conversation came when we decided to contact Rebecca and Jessica, to understand their side of the story and to confront the reality that they had been part of our family's destruction, whether intentionally or not. Emma found Rebecca's address through online records, and after days of debate about whether we had any right to intrude on their lives, we decided that we needed to know the full truth before we could begin to heal from it. I wrote a careful letter explaining who we were and what we had discovered, asking if Rebecca would be willing to meet with us or at least help us understand our father's life from her perspective. The response came within a week, and it was not what we expected. Rebecca agreed to meet us, but she also sent copies of letters our father had written to her over the years, letters that painted us as ungrateful children who resented him and made his life difficult. According to his version of our family, we had been spoiled and demanding, critical of his work schedule and unsupportive of his career. He had portrayed my mother as cold and manipulative, someone who used us children as weapons against him and made it impossible for him to be happy at home. Rebecca's letter was apologetic but also defensive. She had believed she was helping a man escape an unhappy situation, not enabling him to abandon his responsibilities. She had been told we were adults who had rejected him, not children who were confused by his emotional absence. Jessica, who was now 32, had grown up believing that her stepfather's biological children wanted nothing to do with him, that we had chosen to exclude him from our lives rather than the other way around. The depth of his deception was staggering. He had managed to convince both families that the other was the source of his problems. Meeting Rebecca and Jessica was like stepping into an alternate universe where our father had been a completely different person. We met at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop downtown, and the tension was palpable from the moment we sat down. Rebecca was elegant and soft-spoken, clearly nervous but willing to have the conversation. Jessica looked remarkably like Emma, which was jarring and somehow made the whole situation feel even more surreal. As we shared our experiences, a fuller picture of my father emerged, not the simple story of a man who had an affair, but the complex portrait of someone who had constructed elaborate lies to justify his choices to everyone in his life, including himself. To Rebecca, he had been a devoted partner trapped in a loveless marriage by obligation and guilt. To us, he had been a hardworking father doing his best to balance career demands with family responsibilities. To himself, apparently, he had been the victim of circumstances beyond his control, forced to live a divided life because the people he loved couldn't coexist in the same space. Rebecca showed us photos of holidays and celebrations we had never known about, moments of joy and intimacy that felt like proof of our father's capacity for love, evidence that he had simply chosen to direct that love elsewhere. Jessica talked about the man who had taught her to drive, walked her down the aisle at her wedding, and been present for every important moment of her adult life, the father we had always wanted him to be, just not for us. The conversation was civil but emotionally devastating, as we all began to understand that we had been casualties of a man who had refused to make difficult choices, who had preferred to live multiple lives rather than take responsibility for the consequences of any single one. After meeting Rebecca and Jessica, the three of us fell into a depression that lasted months. We had hoped that understanding the full scope of our father's deception would somehow set us free, but instead it felt like we were drowning in the complexity of his lies. How do you forgive someone who had been so fundamentally dishonest that even his love felt like manipulation? How do you mourn a man who had been essentially three different people, none of whom you had fully known? Emma went back to California but called every day, sometimes just to cry with us over the phone. Marcus started seeing a therapist for the first time, trying to work through the rage that had been festering for decades. I threw myself into researching family therapy and trauma recovery, desperate to find a roadmap for healing from this kind of betrayal. We discovered that we weren't alone, that families destroyed by long-term deception and emotional abandonment were more common than any of us had realized. Support groups existed for adult children of narcissistic parents, for families fractured by affairs and financial abuse, for people trying to rebuild their identities after discovering that their entire childhood narrative had been false. Slowly, we began to understand that healing would require us to grieve not just what we had lost, but what we had never had. We needed to mourn the loving father who had never existed, the happy marriage that had been a performance, the secure childhood that had been built on lies. But we also needed to celebrate what we were building together, a relationship based on honesty, mutual support, and the courage to face painful truths rather than maintain comfortable illusions. A year after discovering the letter, we made a decision that would have seemed impossible in our old family dynamic. We chose each other. Emma moved back east, not to the same city but close enough for regular visits. Marcus started opening up about his feelings instead of withdrawing when things got difficult. I stopped trying to fix everyone else's problems and started focusing on my own healing. We established new traditions that had nothing to do with our parents or our childhood, weekend trips to places we had never been, honest conversations about our struggles and successes, holiday celebrations that felt genuine because they were based on who we actually were rather than who we thought we should be. We learned to recognize when one of us was falling into old patterns of emotional avoidance or people-pleasing, and we developed the courage to call each other out with love rather than enabling destructive behaviors. The work was hard and sometimes ugly. There were arguments and setbacks, moments when the old resentments surfaced and threatened to drive us apart again. But we had made a commitment to honesty that was stronger than our fear of conflict, and we kept showing up for each other even when it was difficult. Emma started dating someone seriously for the first time in years, allowing herself to be vulnerable because she was learning what healthy relationships looked like through our sibling bond. Marcus began talking about wanting children, something he had never considered because he couldn't imagine being a better father than our own. I started therapy to work on my trust issues, finally ready to examine why I had been so afraid of commitment and what it might look like to build a romantic relationship on the foundation of emotional honesty we were creating as siblings. Today, 2 years after finding that letter, I can say something I never thought would be possible. I am grateful for the betrayal that destroyed our family's illusions. Not because the pain was worth it, the devastation nearly destroyed all of us, but because living the truth, even when it's ugly, is infinitely better than living a lie, even when it's comfortable. We are no longer the family we used to be, but we are finally becoming the family we were meant to be. Emma, Marcus, and I have relationships now that are deeper and more authentic than anything we experienced in our childhood. We know each other's flaws and fears and love each other anyway, not because we share DNA, but because we have chosen to do the work of actually knowing and supporting each other. My father's betrayal taught us that love without honesty is just a performance, that relationships built on secrets are destined to crumble, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's lies. We still struggle with the legacy of our upbringing. Trust doesn't come easily to any of us, and we all have to work consciously against our instincts to withdraw when relationships become challenging. But we have learned that healing is possible, that families can be rebuilt on better foundations, and that sometimes the worst betrayal can become the catalyst for the most authentic love. I think about my parents sometimes, wondering if they ever imagined how their choices would echo through generations, how their inability to be honest would shape their children's capacity for intimacy. I hope they found peace, but I no longer sacrifice my own well-being trying to preserve their memory or protect their secrets. The family I have now, small but real, is built on truth, and that makes all the difference.